Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Fonzie. Thank you, Anne, for all the preparation in advance of this evening, and to Angela and to Anne Tierney, who I first corresponded with sort of in the summer of last year when this story started to take shape. I must briefly confess that I did live in Bennett's Bridge for 6 months, and I walked quite relatively regularly up the Nore from Bennett's Bridge into Kilkenny, and I used to pass within a few feet, basically, the space where this evening's action took place, and I never imagined that I would come back 14 years later and speak about something I knew nothing about then. Okay, so this is a very beautiful, obscure piece of history. And it happens at a moment when cinema is being born, when the Irish cultural nationalist movement is to some extent reaching its sort of height in the very early years of the 20th century. And it involves many of the great figures involved in cultural nationalism. Someone has already told me this evening that they read my very long article in the Old Kilkenny Review with the emphasis on long, which I'm sorry, it was rather long. But it's hard in some ways to distill easily the amount of fact that lies in the background to this story. But what I'm going to do is I've got 45 slides, well 43 slides now, and I'm going to kind of, in a way, give you a rather stuttery kind of documentary of the play, of the Masque, and to some extent its legacy. Okay, so it does, as Fonzie said, really begin with Standish O'Grady, who had a huge influence on the framing and the forming of national consciousness at the end of the 19th century. And here on the left are the two sort of romance histories that he wrote, one on Finn and his companions, which in a way becomes the basis for the Masque of Finn, and the other one, The Flight of the Eagle, which is about the escape of Hugh Roe O'Donnell from Dublin and his crowning as essentially the leader that he became. And here are two images of Standish O'Grady. I was very proud, actually. I found this image in Belfast. The Old Kilkenny Review was the first publication to publish it. It was an unidentified image of Standish O'Grady standing beside essentially the arch in Sheastown House, which we'll be talking about tonight. And then here on the right is W.B. Yeats's father's drawing of Standish O'Grady looking somewhat dreamy, it has to be said, or looking actually as if he's being attended to by a counsellor or a psychiatrist, which is probably something he needed and didn't actually ever get to having the therapy he required. So these are the two. Fonzie very kindly turned up with obviously a copy of both these originals. These are the two. Both of them were published, both masks were published. Hugh Roe O'Donnell was put on in 1902. The interesting sort of slightly errant fact is that it says here, I've got this yoke, sorry. Here it says Easter 1902, but it actually wasn't performed in Sheastown until August 1902. And as far as we know, this was the first ever performance of it. So I can't quite figure out what's happening. I do have ideas, but I'm not going to go into them now. And then the Masque of Finn, which was initially, I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment, put on in, performed in Phoenix Park in the Lord Lieutenant's residence before a very large crowd of sort of Irish and Anglo-Irish dignitaries, as well as two very sort of Indian princes I recently discovered. And so I'll be talking about that one too. Okay, so this is really the figure who was responsible, I think, more than as much as Standish O'Grady for that evening. And it's someone who really did play a very important, if short-lived, part in Kilkenny culture and politics in the early 20th century. And his name is, and I think that portrait of him is here in Roath House somewhere, but that is the Honourable Otway Frederick Seymour Cuffe, born in 1853 and died on his way to essentially Australia in 1912. And he was the son of the third Earl of Desert and Lady Elizabeth Lucy Campbell, and was quite a kind of important figure as he became in the early 20th century. He began his career in the British Army. He served as a captain in the Rifle Brigade. He was aide-de-camp to the Duke of Connaught in between 1880 and 1881. And then he took up a series of quite significant appointments in the royal household in the 1890s. He was groom of the Privy Chamber to Queen Victoria. He was gentleman usher to King Edward VII and also to King George V from 1910 to 11. So he was pretty close to the heart of royal power. And he, at the same time, as essentially been quite a straightforward unionist, had also developed a deep understanding and sympathy for the cultural nationalist movement in Ireland. Trying to actually trace that development within him is not so easy to do. I think it was very influenced by two moments in his life. Firstly, his meeting with the founder or one of the great figures of the English arts and crafts movement, William Morris, when they were returning by boat together from a trip to Scandinavia, and they spent a few days together. And I think, as you'll see, the arts and crafts side of this story that emerges at the end was very much out of the playbook of William Morris. And then the other important point to understand about Otway Cuffe was his deep commitment to theosophy. And it's quite hard to talk about theosophy because we really know very little about it, and there's very little desire in many ways to engage with it in Ireland or as a kind of spiritual force within cultural nationalism. I mean, we all know about W.B. Yeats and the Golden Dawn and his own friendship with Madame Blavatsky. Roy Foster's written an essay on Protestant magic, where he puts forward a thesis that, in a way, theosophy became an outlet for essentially a kind of descending ascendancy. And then there have been a few other efforts to explain it, but I don't think in a very satisfactory way. And this story this evening is, I think, one of the critical flowering moments of theosophy. More than that, though, of the Gaelic League and indeed of the reframing, especially in this part of the world, of Anglo-Irish power. So Cuffe had drifted as a banker in New York. He came back to London. He was, as I said, part of the royal household. He also became head of a theosophical lodge in London. And he, at that point, seems to have come friendly with Standish O'Grady and his wife, Standish O'Grady's wife, who was another mystic. And then in the late 1890s, he and Standish O'Grady decided to essentially relocate to Kilkenny. Standish O'Grady got a job as the editor of the Kilkenny Moderator, and Cuffe came back because his brother had died, and there was a possibility that he would become the next Earl of Desert. That wasn't, of course, to happen. So when he came back, he bought this house, Sheastown House, on the Nore, basically between Bennett's Bridge and here. And it's still there, it's still occupied. It's not easy to get access to. There will be, I'll talk a little bit more about it in a moment, but this is the footpath along the other side of the Nore from the house. And here you can see the arch where the Masque was performed. And you can see that if you wander along the Nor, but make sure, I mean, you can quite easily miss it. So that was he bought that house and settled down. The third figure, so we've got Standish O'Grady, we've got Otway Cuffe, and the third figure involved in this story, critical figure involved, is an antiquarian from Belfast. This is Francis Joseph Biggar, who was perhaps the most, certainly energetic and widely respected antiquarian of the late 19th and early 20th century. And his house in North Belfast on the Antrim Road, a house called Ardree, became a hothouse for nationalists, for feminists, for progressives in the 1890s and early 20th century. And this was a shot of his famous library where he used to hold ceilidhs. And he had a famous library which is now in the Belfast City Central Library. But he was also a photographer, and he dabbled in a lot of different things. He had resuscitated the Ulster Journal of Archaeology in the early 1890s, which had essentially gone out of circulation for a decade or so. And that became, in many ways, a sort of catalyst for his own search for the kind of deeper histories and kind of mystical meanings of Irishness. It should also be said that he was from an old Presbyterian family from Belfast, from the north, but he was a devoted United Irishman. And he, in the end, although he didn't speak so publicly about it, he did channel tremendous energy towards in a way, the revival, the resuscitation, the resurrection of a lot of memory to do with 1798. And he had been very involved in the centenary commemoration of 1798 in 1898, which he saw as a way by which Belfast could, in a way, raise its profile across Ireland in order for it to be recognised as an intricate part of a 32-county Ireland, 32-county country. Now, this is just, I've got a couple of little sidetracks here. This is a picture of, he also helped, he was an important figure in the Belfast Naturalist Field Club. And this figure here is Robert Lloyd Prager, the naturalist. And this is Francis Joseph Biggar here. And they're both in their 20s. But they were both essentially the kind of leading lights in 1893 of those two naturalist field clubs. And Prager, with the support of Biggar in 1893, this is a very historic photograph, tried to essentially fuse the different naturalists field clubs in Ireland together into a single unity. And from this field trip emerged the Irish Naturalists Field Union, which of course Prager led with great distinction until the outbreak of war in 1914, when essentially these kind of all-Ireland structures just sort of collapsed. But I just thought I'd drop that in. I'm going to drop something else in later on. So Biggar in 1900, and this is a bit of history that I don't think anyone's really ever put together, helped establish essentially a kind of small little unit on the Antrim Road in North Belfast of kind of like-minded young men who met every fortnight, and they put on performances, they gave lectures with lanterns. Biggar had a lantern slide lecture, very similar to the technology I'm using this evening, and they projected onto a screen images and gave lectures, and just as we're doing now, talked. But the neophytes were very much, and the name itself comes from, essentially it means an initiate in theosophical, the language of the Theosophists. It was the sort of beginning of the kind of entry into the theosophical movement. And in a hall at the back of St. Peter's Parish Church on the Antrim Road, they met, as well as in Ardree. They had field trips, and they also decided to put on the play that we're going to be talking about. Now, this is just, I suppose, a little bit of a taking us in a slightly different direction. During the 1890s, theosophy was, in a way, so significant in Ireland at an intellectual level. I mean, it's rarefied, but it's happening. That there was a monthly publication called The Irish Theosophist, which I think ran from about 1893 to 1897. And in fact, this is the last issue of it, published on August the 15th, interestingly enough, which was Ladies' Day, the day that the Masque in 1902 was held. But you can see the founding of Emin Masque, the subject matter of the Irish Theosophist in the later editions is very much involved with drawing out discussion on Irish mythology. Okay, so you get a lot of discussion around Irish mythological themes. And what I think happens is that when the Irish Theosophist shuts down in 1897, Standish O'Grady and others of that world, like A.E., like Ella Young, who we'll talk more about in a moment, like Yeats, they realize that they need another outlet. And that eventually becomes the All Ireland Review, which of course begins its life here in Kilkenny and is sponsored partly by money from Lady Desert and Otway Cuffe. Okay, so, and I haven't yet fully formulated this. I need to do more work, but I think there is to my mind, there's a very strong connection between those two publications. This is, in 1901, Biggar visited Kilkenny and Sheastown and Otway Cuffe, and just to attend essentially a sort of gala night in the garden, and that was exactly a year before the Masque was performed. And there's quite a lot of reporting in the All Ireland Review of that event. It began actually with a cricket match in the afternoon and then led on to a performance by Otway Cuffe's gymnasts. He set up a gymnastic club at the back of the theatre in Patrick Street, which was in the process of being built. And in the journal that I just showed you, the Journal of the Neophytes, there is this essay written by Herbert Hughes about the story of Hugh Roe O'Donnell, which starts off with a very strong compliment to Standish O'Grady, essentially thanking him for providing the history that allowed this lecture to happen. Herbert Hughes was a very close friend of Francis Joseph Biggar. He was about to go to the Royal College of Music in London. He was a brilliant musician. He was a folklorist, and he also was a collector of traditional music. And he was also the father of a great jazz trombonist called Spike Hughes, for those jazz nerds amongst us. Anyway, what you can see in this lecture, I mean, there are about 12 pages of an essay, essentially, is that in the margins here you have that accompanied the lecture, and you may be able to read, it says Derrick the Feast, and this is John Derrick's Story of Ireland, which was the 1581 Elizabethan images of Ireland, the Elizabethan printed text. These are woodcuts of essentially different scenes from that period, and they used those. And I think in many ways the performance of Hugh Roe O'Donnell very much emerges out of the kind of Derrick imagery of that period. I should also mention that I think what you have here is a meeting of essentially a kind of nascent theosophy, in a way trying to come out into the open. I mean, theosophy is essentially, Madame Blavatsky, who was the founder of the movement, sort of felt it was essentially a sort of secret, it was a secret movement. But like all secret organizations, you could make the same case for the intelligence services, they get to a point where they have to sort of start coming out into the open. And I think, again, what's interesting about this Masque is that it is an effort to try and sort of create a more transparent public understanding of what that is. Although it wasn't obviously spelled out on the night, I think there's a lot in the publication of the actual play that would suggest that that's what's happening. And I suppose the other important point to make about the play is that it is a significant symbolic linking between the Ulster cultural revival and what's happening in the south. I mean, Biggar and other northern cultural revivalists felt to some extent alienated, that they weren't part of the broader discussion. And so they really tried to create this sense of all Ireland, and which I think, again, is very much at the heart of the kind of symbolic importance of this. Cuffe also was going up to visit Biggar at Ardrey in Belfast. Here again is a little excerpt from the Journal of the Neophytes, actually written by Bluemantle, which was, they all had pseudonyms, they all had their own sort of code names, and Biggar was Bluemantle, and Herbert Hughes was Portcullis. But as you can see here, in last October, Captain Cuffe visited Ardrey and met the neophytes. He then went to Scotland and returned by Glasgow steamer on a Sunday morning, having to go to Dublin same day by the train at about noon. The captain and Mrs. Cuffe were most anxious to climb Cave Hill, as they had not previously had an opportunity of doing so. The Pliocene wanderer, another of the figures, another of the neophytes, volunteered to rise at 5 a.m, meet the Glasgow boat at 6 a.m. Okay, so that was it. The other two figures that we should mention here are Alice Milligan, who was a very formidable figure in the Gaelic League at this time, and was essentially a travelling lecturer for the Gaelic League. And then Jane O'Flanagan, better known as Sinead de Valera, who at the beginning of that year in 1902 helped Alice Milligan put on a performance of her play The Deliverance of Red Hugh O'Donnell, which was published somewhere. I haven't yet managed to track it down. It's not as accessible as the O'Grady work. But again, it's what's interesting is that there was a lot happening in and around Red Hugh O'Donnell, and Alice Milligan was, we know at that time from correspondence in the bigger papers, doing a lot to essentially facilitate Standish O'Grady and Otway Cuffe's various journeys up north. So yeah, before I go into the production itself, it's just worth speaking perhaps briefly about Red Hugh O'Donnell. You may have seen last year and the last few years, the only reason he makes the newspapers these days is because every September in Spain now, there is a mock funeral of Red Hugh O'Donnell in Valladolid. And if you look on the, if you Google it, you'll find quite interesting little clips of film of Spaniards dressing up as 16th century soldiers and marching through the somewhat ugly streets of Valladolid in homage to Red Hugh. But Red Hugh in many ways was this allegorical figure. This is how Standish O'Grady had really constructed him. Someone who defied Elizabethan power. He escapes from imprisonment. He manages to make his way back to Donegal, where he is crowned. And his story really serves as this kind of metaphor for this allegory of Ireland's escape from British captivity. And of course, he's also seen as a very skillful military leader. But if you read the more recent history, for instance, there would be questioning of just how competent he was as a military leader. But I mean, that didn't bother cultural nationalists. Okay, so let's look at the production itself. This is, again, back to my walk along the Nore. You can see very faintly here, there's the arch. It's a beautiful bit of the river, and that was last summer. And these are the names of the members of the neophyte. These were the neophytes, the 10 of them, and then Francis Joseph Biggar, and then the Honourable Secretary Herbert Hughes. And each of those figures, Turner, Robinson, Reynolds, Parrott, Donald, Hugh, the two Hughes brothers, Grant and Foster, all of them had parts as dramatis personae in the play or in the Masque. And then you can see soldiers, drummers, etc. were the Kilkenny boys, and horseboy Davin, was that Angela? Yeah, might have views on that. And then the harper and the pipe, I'll talk more about those in a moment. So that was the dramatis persona. These were the scenes. 12 scenes. It was a kind of the libretto which Fonzie's bought this evening. Very, very short. It's like 30 pages long. I mean, if you read it, it would take half an hour. But the Masque itself went on for 3 hours. And I suppose I should just quickly explain. Masques as essentially as a genre really peaked at the end of the 16th and beginning of the 17th centuries. The Tempest, most famously, has a masque and an anti-masque. Shakespeare loved masques. Masques were mainly put on by either monarchs or senior aristocrats and were intended to encourage kind of social cohesion. They brought people from all different classes together. A spectacle was performed, food and drink were enjoyed, and everyone went away happy. And it is really interesting that both the Gaelic League and the cultural nationalists are experimenting with that genre. And as you can see, apart from the narrative, you had music. Here were the different songs, and then the conductors, Standish O'Grady here. At the bottom, you can't read this at the back. It says the play written by Standish O'Grady, stage management by Otway Cuffe, acting by Thomas Brooke, costumes by Mrs. O'Grady, music by Herbert Hughes, and characters, the arrangement of characters, Francis Joseph Biggar. So here are the images of the tents that were erected. They came at the very beginning of August. They erected these tents and on the bank, below the arch that you saw. And as Fonzie said, there was the slightly sort of murky image here. This is Alexander Hogg, and here it says photographic specialist, lanternist, cinematographer, 13 Trinity Street, Belfast. Okay, so he was again part of the Belfast contingent, and here are various actors or various neophytes lounging around. You can see they have a shaving bowl there. That is Biggar, and I think that is Herbert Hughes outside a tent. I think possibly most of the neophytes were accommodated in that large tent. And this is essentially an image of the rehearsal. Here is Biggar walking away. They constructed essentially these makeshift seats, and they were there for about 10 days. The one source that I haven't looked at, which I didn't discover until I'd left Belfast last year, was that there is a scrapbook that Biggar put together, which is still in the Belfast Central Library. And yeah, the musicians, quite interesting. Owen Lloyd, who was a great harpist, I mean, a really stunning harpist. He went on to teach harp at Patrick Pearce's school, St Enders, but he's now considered really one of the great early 20th century harpists. And R.L. O'Mauleyer, he also is a fascinating figure. He was from Westmeath, But I think Biggar partly funded him to go up to Belfast and to set up a piping manufacturing workshop and a piping school. And there's a whole, when I was researching this, I got in touch with the Pipers Club, and they gave me some images which I use at the end, and I was just sucked into this wonderfully obscure dimension of Irish musical history. But they told me that the O'Malley archive is still held in the Pipers Club. So, and then here are some of the players. Now, I think what you really can see from these, and I didn't go into enough detail, and these are the two of the better images. They're not all as good as these, but the costumes were exquisite. I mean, they are really, the detail is absolutely stunning. And I suppose that the point to make here is that, Biggar was he loved flags and banners, and he loved sort of pageantry. And in a way, what we see he does with St. Fiacre, I mean, he came down here in 1912, and he gave a beautiful banner to the St. Canice pipe band, which you have an image of at the end. But the costumes here are exquisite. This is Red Hugh, the young Red Hugh O'Donnell, standing on a rock with his sword in hand. And here, and I know this is one of the figures. I can't remember which of the men it is, but boys it is. But who plays the part of two women looking remarkably awkward, actually, I think, in that particular, actually in all the photos. But it's kind of interesting too that, they didn't have, there was kind of no issue. And of course, that's very Shakespearean. I mean, in Shakespeare's plays in the 16th and 17th century, men played the role of women. This was a review, actually, in the Ulster Journal of Archaeology by Biggar of the published Masque. I think it's interesting just to quickly read the quote from the prologue here, because I think you get a sense of what's happened. Outside the published play, Fonzie, published in the All Ireland Review, is this prologue of maybe 30 to 40 lines, in which Lady O'Kerrin, who was one of the Butler family, as well as Otway Cuffe, played these parts of essentially a kind of narrators, but narrators of stature. And this is the part spoken by Lady O'Kerrin. She says, "And in the chilly far-off northern land, by ways past telling formed a gentle band. With one consent, and like one man, they planned to visit thee and thine, and let you know the loving comradeship they would bestow. Brave, proud Ultonia hither sends today her gallant children here to act their play. In gentle bonds they would unite once more Ulster and Leinster, the Lagan and the Nor." So it's all about drawing together the kind of the ancient geographies of Ulster or Ultonia and Kilkenny. Okay, so this is, I think, Francis Joseph Biggar's sort of technical take on in a way that the scene that was set, and I think it's well worth. I do quote it in my overlong article for the Kilkenny Review, but the scenery was shown by a magic lantern from behind a huge screen surrounded by a high ruined arch. Each picture was from a photograph or drawing of the actual place referred to in the play, coloured to life. Great sidelights illuminated the figures on the raised stage in the front of the screen, the actors wearing accurate costumes of the period. Thousands of spectators were present. It's a sort of monster moment. And the performance was received with great enthusiasm. Irish pipers and a harper supplied the music and songs, and choruses were numerous throughout the play in their fitting places. The arms and banner were correctly appropriated. Now, very Biggar putting a line in there, boasting about his own eye for detail. But I suppose what you see there is a moment of proto-cinema. You know, cinema is about to explode on the world. And what is happening here in Kilkenny is this sort of intermediary moment between cinema and theatre. And it's fascinating, I think. So this is the photograph of the players. And as you can see along the bottom here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, I thought there were 10. Anyway, those were the 10 neophytes. And then behind them were all the Kilkenny lads who, were played soldiers and other things. And I think that's, I don't know if we can identify any of these people, but I'm sure that would be a challenge for someone local one day. Okay, so I want to talk briefly about the reception now. So yeah, here's one comment. I think here, it's kind of amusing, this guy saying, okay, look, let's go down to Sheastown, and these kind of lads from Kilkenny, and but we didn't come back in half an hour nor in 3.5 hours, and to tell the truth, we tore ourselves away reluctantly from the scene after 7.5 hours. So it went on for 3.5 hours. Okay, so there's no, it was a blockbusting kind of a moment. Here from the Kilkenny Journal, you get some of the more illustrious members of local society: Lady St Leven, Viscount Vantus Ikerins, William Lady Blunden, Vernie Lascelles, Baroness Prochaska. I know there was an article on that recently. On shore, Mrs. George Butler, that's Hubert Butler's mother and father. Okay, so that's that. This, I think, is one of the more interesting discoveries, was the references in Ella Young's book. And now that's a very rare book, Fonzie would know that, The Flowering Dusk, Things Remembered and Accurately and Inaccurately. And Ella Young was one of the great sort of mystic poets of the Cultural Revival, ended up in California teaching Celtic studies in University of California. And her biography is extraordinary. But in it, she talked very briefly, well, quite actually at some length, but here is, I think, a very powerful bit of description of the play. The play ended with the escape of Red Hugh and was followed by a pageant representing the triumphant home welcome accorded by chiefs and clansmen in Tyrconnell. Magnificent horses led by running footboys, pipers drawing music from their war pipes, shield-bearing warriors, bards, historians, I don't know how you recognise them, shouting children made sound and brightness among the trees and grassy spaces of the domain. Yeah, and then Lady Desert herself said, it was a most brilliant success, the park lending itself admirably to the occasion. All the country from far and near flocked over to see the performance. Sheastown was thrown open to all comers, high and low, gentry, townspeople, farmers, artisans, labourers, were alike welcomed and refreshed body and mind. To anyone knowing Sheastown, it is to this day a mystery how the Bannaty, the lady of the house, so satisfactorily catered for the numbers that came to her to be fed, that not one went away hungry or thirsty. And okay, so I now want to get you to think about the legacy. And in a way, this is, in some ways, quite sad. Before I talk about this, I think I'll say that in 1904, Francis Joseph Bigger held a famous feis in the Glens of Antrim, which is remembered in many different ways until today. And Otway Cuffe went up, Otway and the Cuffes went up for that event and played quite a significant part in it. And also the costumes that had been worn at the Masque were also, I found references in writing to the fact that there were Elizabethan players walking around Antrim at the feis in those costumes. But I've unfortunately never found photographs, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're there, because Bigger's archive is still in a bit of a mess. Literally 3 months after the performance of the Masque of Hugh Roe O'Donnell. The Lady Desert and Otway Cuffe opened the theatre on Patrick Street, which was a huge moment of local cultural achievement. And sadly, the theatre's no longer there. But again, I think that's a wonderful photograph because you can see reflected in it. So, I mean, I don't know what the bridge is. That an Ishtig bridge or is that a Kilkenny bridge? I got on the curtain there. Oh, it's in Kilkenny. Yeah, and then the sunbursts, which are also interesting. But that was the theatre. So I think all of these events in different ways emerged from that moment. The following year, on the 5th of September of 1903, there is a very long report in the Kilkenny People about the pattern of St. Fiacre. And the photographs I didn't show tonight of the neophytes on the banks of the Nore were a couple of images which unfortunately I just couldn't get good enough quality pictures of, but they are there, of the neophytes doing rubbings of the tombs in the little cemetery. Am I right? In St. Fiacre's, is there a little cemetery there? And yeah, so that is one gap in the story tonight. But certainly it seems from that press report in 1903 that moment was very much sort of reinvented as a consequence of the kind of discussions that had happened in the making of the Masque. And then, of course, in 1906, you had the opening of the woolen mills, that beautiful suspension bridge. This is all in different ways, I think, kind of an emergent sort of consequence of the woodworkers' factory. And I actually walked past P.T. Murphy's tonight, and one of their two shop fronts was made by the woodworkers, and you can see the little signature Kilkenny workers on the right hand side. I'm sure you all know that. The best thing to read, which is even longer than the thing I wrote, is Nicky Gordon Bowes' excellent article in the Irish Architectural and Decorative Studies journal on the wild heath that's broken out again in the Heatherfield, which looks at essentially the work that Otway Cuffe and Lady Desert and others were responsible for in the early 20th century. It's also worth mentioning that the moment triggers a kind of theatrical revival in Ulster too. Here you can see O'Mealy here in the centre on the stage of an early performance of the Ulster Literary Theatre, and here's Cathal O'Byrne, the writer who wrote, was one of the great essayists and recordists, writers of Belfast of that period and into the middle of the last century. And I can't identify anyone else there. Okay, so I'll move on now to briefly, I'm very conscious I've nearly talked for an hour or 50 minutes, but I am winding down. This was the Masque of Finn, which is, the photograph was in the National Library, There are a series of names at the bottom here, which are quite hard to decipher, but I managed to do it. This figure on the left is obviously an unnamed piper, but I'm sure that face is familiar. I don't know who it is. This is Mr. Cardew, who's named in the newspapers, but fortunately most of the cast were named. This is Hubert O'Grady, one of Standish O'Grady's children. This is Diarmaid Cuffe. I'm going to do a little detour in a moment as a result of Diarmaid Cuffe. But Diarmaid Cuffe was involved he was George Cuffe, the antiquarian director of the National Museum of Ireland. It was his son, and he becomes a very significant figure within in a way, the sort of politicizing of the cultural movement in around 1912. Here you have Elizabeth Young, Ella Young's sister, Here is Otway Cuffe on his knees before Ella Young, and you can't. The quality here isn't so great, but actually you can find this. And then here are Con O'Grady, another of Standish O'Grady's children, W.P. Hone, who has quite a distinguished life, which I won't go into, who was playing Finn, and a Mr. White, who I couldn't identify. But that was the Finn. Now this masque, which was performed in the Woolen Mills in 1907, had been initially performed the year before in Phoenix Park, before a party, a kind of garden party given by Lord and Lady Aberdeen. And at that, as I mentioned earlier, there was a very, very impressive gathering of kind of potentates and powerful figures within the ascendancy class, and indeed others, and as I said, Indian Mahatmas. And this is my little detour, and I think again it's another of these forgotten plays. Diarmaid Cuffe in 1900 had celebrated his 11th birthday thanks to his parents in his garden just off St Stephen's Green. And this was the first performance of Deirdre that was performed. I mean, it was a play that was performed on a number of different occasions, a number of different productions. George Russell was one of the actors. I think this is George Russell here. This is Elizabeth Young. Ella Young also performed in it. And the other interesting figure is R.I. Best, who went on to be the director of the National Library of Ireland. But Cuffe was obviously, by 1907, when that photograph was taken of him standing with the other members of the cast in the Masque of Finn, he was, 17 or something. And then that was one of A's, not A's drawings. That was one of the watercolour of Elizabeth Young as Deirdre. Yeah, okay, this is where I end. I've talked nearly for an hour. I suppose one of the other legacies, which I could talk a bit more about, was the enormous amount of both encouragement and financial and moral support that Francis Joseph Biggar gave to the founding of the Kilkenny Pipers Club or the War Pipers Band. But Biggar founded War Pipers bands all around Ireland, and the Kilkenny one was an important one. This in the background here is the banner that he presented to the band in 1912, and there's quite a long description of the lecture he gave that night, again using lantern slides. Here's an earlier image from, I think, the Irish Times in, I think, 1908 or 9 of the Kilkenny Pipers, and here's an interesting picture of Lady Desart with the Kells pipe and drum band outside her house in Talbot's Inch. Look, that is not a proper ending to a lecture, but I'm afraid you're going to have to take it.